the more you have, the better your argument is. And that's what Paul first uses. He uses sheer numbers. He says there were 500 people that saw Jesus alive after his death. And many of them are still alive today. And there's a reason he says many of them are still alive today. Because you can actually go up to that people and say, hey, did you see Christ alive? Yes, I did. And from that, that's actual sheer testimony. That's what Paul is going into great detail. And it sort of negates the argument that a lot of people had, which, it was just a hallucination. Which I think is one of the funniest arguments, because it's hard for 500 people to all hallucinate the same thing. And even more difficult is 11 of his disciples all seeing the exact same event and all witnessing Jesus hold out his hands for Thomas. And we see that the numbers provide credibility. But like in any good course case, 500 people aren't just simply because you could get 500, lowlifes to all agree on a story. So you want police testimony, which are your credible witnesses, the witnesses you can trust. And so Paul then goes into the man of good character. He describes himself, because the Corinthians had gained a trust in him. He describes Peter, describes the other disciples. These are all men that the Corinthians had known to trust. And so he uses that as evidence to show, hey, these men of great character that you know that they would not lie to you, they're all saying the same thing. And so that's what Paul uses second. And lastly, expert testimony. Because, in court cases, you always have that doctor come in who's the expert. He knows if somebody's, full of garbage or is actually telling the truth. And he can give that to you. And Paul gives us James, the brother of Christ. The man who probably could pick Jesus out of a crowd because he grew up with him. He spent all that time playing with him as a kid, growing up, and even spent some time, he didn't quite get saved until after the resurrection. And that's what did it for James, was the resurrection. And he saw his brother alive, and that confirmed to him the gospel message. See, what we have to look for this expert testimony, like if my sister came through that door right now, you all would be witness to her coming in. However, would any of you know that is my sister? It wouldn't be. If I told you it was my sister, then you could all say that you saw my sister. You go tell someone else you saw my sister here. That means something, okay. But when I say it, people know, because I'm not going to get fooled by an imposter when my sister walks into. So, you see, Paul gives us the sheer numbers, the credible witnesses, and the expert witnesses. But Paul kind of ends his argument right there. And that's where I'm going to sort of piggyback onto what Paul says, because unfortunately there's a lot of other arguments that kind of goes into what I alluded to earlier. The testimony is credible.
Hallelujah.
And see, that's what we have to look at, really focus. And I'm going to hone in on Matthews 28 and 27. We'll see 27, verse 62 to 66. And this is taking place after Jesus was buried. Now the next day, that followed the day of the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees came together unto Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember that the deceiver said, while he was yet alive, After 3 days I will rise again. Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night, and steal him away, and say unto the people, He is risen from the dead. So the last error shall be worse than the first. Pilate said unto them, Ye have a watch. Go your way, make it as sure as ye can. So they went, and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone, and setting a watch. And later we see in Matthew 28, 12 through 16, And when they were assembled with the elders, this is after the body is missing, and had taken counsel, they gave large money unto the soldiers, saying, Say ye, his disciples came by night, and stole him away while we slept. And if this come to the governor's ear, we will persuade him, and secure you. So they took the money, and did as they were taught. And this saying is commonly reported to the Jews until this day. And it's still one of the principal arguments on explaining the empty tomb. Because that's the missing ingredient. Because we have, as Christians, especially at that time, they had a tremendous power. It was the power known as habeas corpus, where you have to present the body. And we actually have that in our legal system where, we're giving a writ of habeas corpus where somebody has to come into the courtroom. However, here, all they had to do, the Jews or the Romans, to stop the Christian movement, the early beginnings, was show the body of Christ. But they couldn't because the body was missing. Why was it missing? Well, there's two explanations that are given. First, you have the explanation of the leaders and the Jewish priests and stuff that were saying that the apostles stole the body. The apostles' explanation was that Jesus resurrected. So let's just quickly examine the first one. The Roman guards come. And you got to imagine, a lot of times you have one or two guards, whenever you see the Easter play that you always have at church. But really, most of them have at least 4 guards come to watch at any time. That way, there will always guarantee that someone is standing watch and paying close attention. Now, according to this story, given by the leaders, they fall asleep. And then in the middle of all this, in the middle of the night, a group of disciples come and tiptoe through the group of Roman soldiers, who, by the way, happen to be asleep, roll away the stone, and then carry the body of Christ off. First, we'll begin with the falling asleep. The odds of this are low at best. Because as we can see from the biblical account, when the body was missing, they were afraid because a Roman doesn't fall asleep. A Roman cannot fall asleep. They will be executed by their chain of command. It's not like today where, you fall asleep and, the sergeant comes up and kicks you over the head and yells at you, and that's about it. Maybe gives you some push-ups. No, it was death if you fell asleep on guard duty. So let's say that all 4 of them fall asleep. The second step is that disciples come and sneak through the camp. But let's look at these disciples. What happened to them when Jesus got arrested? They scattered 4 winds. The only one that really even stayed close was John. All the rest of them were off. Some of them were watching, but they were all hiding out in the crowd. They didn't want to get caught because they would suffer likely the same punishment that Jesus was suffering. They were afraid. And, rightly so. We always look back from, our perspective and say, oh, we wouldn't have done that. I'll be honest. Really looking at myself, I probably would have done the same thing as Peter. Which, let's look at Peter. This is a man who, he was confronted by a damsel and a maid. And he couldn't even acknowledge that he knew Christ. These are 2 people that probably couldn't have done anything to him. But he was terrified to be seen as being with Jesus. And this same man got the other disciples who also left, and they snuck through a camp, which, fortunately for them, the Roman guards happened to be asleep. Because there's no way they could have known. They would have had to go in there expecting that these 4 well-armed guards are fully awake and ready to fight. So we have to look at that. And then, after this, these 11 men have to roll away a stone. Which we always, as I said before, you always picture this well-constructed wheel just sort of sitting in front. And, you can push it this way and push it that. Oh, it's fairly easy. But what you got to realize is it's a giant boulder that's in like a divot that you actually have to use a lever system just to get it out. And that's lots of strong men using a lever system. So they would have had to bring in a lever with them and roll this boulder away using all of their strength, which still they would have probably made some noise. And that implies that the Roman guards were so asleep that 11 disciples walking through their camp and rolling a giant stone wouldn't have woken them up. That even makes the sleeping thing that much more ridiculous. And so I think as we look at this, in reality, what we consider reason to be almost more unreasonable when we really look at all the things. Why is that? Because it goes against the characteristics of all the parties involved. First of all, you have the Roman soldiers falling asleep. They don't do that. There's very few instances which you can find that happening, and they wouldn't have done that on this occasion. Why? Because they would have been afraid to die. You have